Hi, we're at the 28th Annual Construct Canada Trade Show. I'm joined today by Mark Casaletto, President of ConstructConnect Canada. Today, Mark, you spoke about the outlook for Canada in 2018. When you look across the sector in Canada, I'm curious to know what regions do you feel are best positioned for growth next year?
Well, when you look ahead over the next 12 months, the regions in Canada that are more closely tied to the U.S., because the U.S. economy right now has been a leader in global growth. They've kind of counterbalanced the slowness in Europe and the slowing down in China. So what regions in Canada have the most or the strongest ties to the U.S.? Well, Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and to a certain extent British Columbia are all doing really well from a GDP year-over-year growth. And what that means is you're creating jobs, you have confidence in the economies, and therefore you have the tendency to have more investment, public and private. And the one thing Ontario has going for it is Toronto. Ontario represents 38% of the country's population, and Toronto represents, literally, if you think about it, 1 in 3 Canadians live within an hour of Toronto. So it's an economy within an economy, and it's growing, it's very robust. And if I were to kind of look ahead over the next 12 months, anything with strong ties to the US, you're going to see relatively more investment, both public and private. Now, what you'll start to see later in 2018, we think, is the emergence of the resource sector again. Prospecting is at an all-time high. And so you'll start to see northern Quebec, northern Ontario, northern Saskatchewan, to a certain extent Alberta, start to see some growth there as well. Yeah.
Okay, from a global perspective now, when you look at global forces, what forces do you feel will be driving or impacting the Canadian economy going into 2018?
It's a good question. I mean, it's interesting. So much of Canada's economy is not dependent on what happens in our country. Our domestic economy is actually very small. Our economy is completely dependent on the world. So when you look around the world, again, I'll go back to the US, 80% of everything we do ends up on average in the United States. So we got to keep an eye on the US, politically, socially. There are decisions being made there every day that impact us, good, bad, or ugly. So we got to keep an eye on that. Europe, I think, is really important. Europe has gone through a decade where they call it the lost decade. But Europe's emerging again. It's starting to show a pulse, and it's important for Canada because we just signed a pretty significant free trade deal with them. Now that'll take effect in the coming years, but the build up towards that, the anticipation, the speculation, and the fact that it's re-emerging is a good sign for Canada. China's important because China consumes 50% of what the world produces, and this is true with raw materials. And Canada has the highest resource deposits in the world. So China's a big customer. And the fact that China is kind of getting through its reinvention of its economy, I mean, the Chinese economy slowed from like an absolute sprint to a quick pace, and that actually recalibrated resource demand, which impacted our economy. But China, the reemergence of the Chinese economy to a very quick pace, the fact that they're going to be consuming more raw materials, the fact that Europe is showing signs of life, the fact that US, these are all the big regions that have a direct impact on us, yeah.
So you touched a bit on the US. How much, us being so tied closely to them, how much do you think their economy is going to impact not just the Canadian economy, but construction overall?
Yeah, here's a fun fact. The US consumes 25% of what the world produces. So 1 in 4 of everything that's produced in the world, Americans are consuming it. That's how important that economy is to the world. And since 80% of what we produce ends up there, it's huge, right? So what's happening in the US for a long time now, I mean, they had a serious financial crisis in 2008. It took them a number of years to kind of get through that. But what's happened for a sustainable amount of time, we're talking the last 6 years or so, you've seen the reemergence of the housing sector. You've seen unemployment really fall, service sector employment rise. They're just consuming more stuff, and that's important, and it has a huge impact on us. it has a huge impact on the global economy. And it's actually been good timing because, quite frankly, as China slowed, as the European economy was figuring itself out, the US economy rebalanced the global economy and kind of kept it above water. So, yeah, I mean, not just us, the whole world watches the US. It's really important. And, you know, there's so much politically going on down there, socially. Yeah, you know what? It's really a lightning rod right now.
Interesting times ahead, to say
Yes,
the least.
absolutely.
Mark, thank you for stopping and chatting with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.